Okay, so hello everyone. So today's talk is, what is it exactly? Climate change?
It's that, dealing with the climate crisis. It's that you said in these days we wish would never come. This is your word.
The global warming crisis and making a future possible.
The global warming crisis and making a future possible. Sounds really good, doesn't it? Okay. I only recently became aware of how dire the situation is, which may sound kind of crazy, like I've been living under a rock. But I've spent the last 10 years in an Indian slum where I've been helping really poor people battle things like getting clean water, stopping bride burnings, stopping child marriage, stopping rape, stopping domestic violence. So I was dealing with those kind of issues, and those issues seemed very pressing to me, whereas the idea of climate crisis seemed, something that might happen in 50 years or something. And then a friend of mine who I very much respect, who is the kind of person who reads science journals, was like, well, if there is no planet, there can't be any social justice. And I was like, oh. And then the penny dropped, and I was like, wow, this is actually the most pressing issue. And I think it terrifies a lot of people. It creates huge anxiety. And it's like the people on the Titanic who realize we haven't got enough escape boats and think it's unsinkable, like the sun will never set on the British Empire, and that sunset. So that idea that pride amongst certain people in power that they're invincible and that nothing can change or challenge their power, or a magical fantasy that we can easily find a solution without actually trying to find one. Business as normal, like a kind of denial. And then some of us think of climate change and feel helpless, like it's such a huge problem, what can I do? Just getting a bamboo toothbrush is not going to cut it, or giving up my plastic bag or whatever, So you go, there's these the stages of grief and denial. Like, first of all, it's like feeling frozen, feeling terrified. Then it's like grieving and anger and bargain making, and finally it's acceptance. The stages of grief. And I think it's okay to have grief around climate change. I mean, your generation should be angry, and the generation in high school now should be even more angry, because they're going to live in really difficult times, but denial will not help change it. And this is a critical time. If we don't keep emissions under 1.5 degrees in the next 10 years, if we keep emitting carbon at the rate that we are, we will not be able to reduce that critical temperature threshold. And if we produce too much pollution, we'll create a chain of, like a domino effect, where we just can't pull back climate change, and we'll create a lot of really bad follow-on effects, like desertification and, the end of rain-fed glaciers that a lot of the world relies on to irrigate their fields, the drying up groundwater, a lot of parts of Southeast Asia will be underwater. The glaciers in the north and south, the icebergs melting and causing the oceans to rise. So a lot of Pacific nations, as well as a lot of Southeast Asian nations, especially Bangladesh, Burma, Singapore, they're all going to be underwater. A lot of Buddhist places, actually. And Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Southeast Asia, you know, the Philippines, the bread, Indonesia, the bread bowl. And a lot of the water that feeds, you know, the glaciers in the mountains that feed China's farming, that feed the Andes in South America. A lot of those, and the monsoon effect that helps Pakistan and India grow their food will be affected. So it's going to be pretty dire if we don't reduce our emissions. And you know, I'm not an expert on all of this. You can Google this, and it probably will scare the bejesus out of you, you know, and it should. But there comes a point where being afraid and being terrified and being in shock is no longer productive, and where we need to have some hope. And we need to, what I call pragmatic hope. So even if we can't win, we're going to do our damnedest to try. And I call that socially engaged Buddhism with a heart of love, with a heart of hope punk, the hope that we can beat this, that we can do our best to change the course of history. You know that they say to change society only takes a committed group of 3.5% of people who are discontent to start a revolution. And it's so easy, if you're someone who actually cares about humanity and the world and the planet, it's so easy to become very cynical, or to feel like you can't do anything, to think that everybody is bad, selfish, shitty, to feel no hope in our leaders who are bought by corporations. It's easy to feel a sense of hopelessness, but it's not productive. So we need to bring a little bit of love back into our activism. You know, the idea that goodness can change things, that people are connected, that people can be united, that we can build solidarity, that people do want to do good things. And the way, you know, the problem is connecting love and the actions required to change things. And there is a wonderful African-American feminist called Bell Hooks. She talks about love a lot. She talks about love in activism and love in feminism. And she said, you know, if you go around, you know, door to door and you ask people, do you want to end domestic violence? Most people will say yes. Most people don't like the idea of women being beaten and murdered, or even men being beaten and murdered. But then you talk about the change necessary to bring about the end of domestic violence, like addressing patriarchy, addressing the way we raise our sons, male rage, and so forth. Making the social changes necessary to bring about the end of domestic violence. Then people become political and they become divided in their opinion. And between the ideal of what they want and the work and action required to do it, there is a disconnect. So we see on the news, you know, the glaciers are melting, the polar bears are dying, the koalas are dying, but it's like someone else is doing it. We have an out-of-body experience in relation to climate change. Not me. It's other people, not me. But actually, why does it matter that we care? Why does it matter that we try? Okay, you've heard of the idea of interdependence, interbeing. You know, what are the elements that create your existence, without which you cannot live? Water, air, food, farmers growing our food, the earth, mother, father, ancestors, yeah, education. All of these things affect us. Everybody is a collection of social, political, cultural, economic, physical conditions. Change someone's, they're an intersection of time and space. Take away one of those non-self elements, you are no longer the same. If you and I had been raised in a sub-Saharan Africa, we would be completely different, you know? I don't know exactly the statistics, but I think it's like less than, 15% of the world, maybe even less. 10% of the world goes to university. I could be but you know, we're pretty privileged to be here. So everything is interconnected. They even say that the shaking of a butterfly's wing, that little bit of wind, can then cause a chain of cause and effect that becomes a hurricane somewhere on the other side of the world. And you know that saying, if you don't think that something small can make a difference, try spending a night with a mosquito. Yeah? All it requires is 3.5% of the population to say, we don't want undrinkable water. We don't want children growing up without food. We don't want developing nations underwater. We believe that people are equal, that everybody deserves human rights, that the planet is sacred and deserves our respect and care. Yeah. It's common sense, actually. So in terms of solutions, there is a really good movie called 2040. It kind of oversimplifies the solutions, but it's pretty good for the average Joe to suggest. It suggests 5 concrete solutions for dealing with climate change. So 1 is planting forests. 2 is rotational sustainable farming, which is instead of having cattle overgrazing, you move the animals around in a nomadic way, the way they used to in the old days. You allow the grasses to grow back to create nitrogen in the soil. You rotate crops, you use organic farming. You try to keep the carbon in the ground. Yeah. Going vegan, divesting from fossil fuels, at least eating less meat, because methane, animal farming produces a great deal of pollution. You know, even in the way we invest our superannuation, you know, divesting from fossil fuel corporations, because they drive a lot of the stock market, they drive a lot of corporations. Do you know that like most of the products we buy are owned by about 7 corporations in the world? Like it's funny, but most of the products we buy only go back to about 7 corporations. Our entire news system is owned by one man, Murdoch. Yeah. Whether it's a left-wing newspaper like The Australian or a more conservative newspaper, it's both owned by Murdoch. Okay? There is a specific kind of kelp seaweed that grows very quickly, and it can sequester thousands of tons of carbon per square kilometre per year. So these kind of kelp could be a source of food when rain-fed farming fails, which it will at the rate we're going in about 20 years. I live near Lithgow, which is way out in the Blue Mountains. The city of Bathurst has 10 months of water left. Once you leave the city, it's a dry, barren wasteland until once you get past the Blue Mountains, the fields are dry, the grass is turning to dust. The city of Dubbo has 4 months water left, the town of Dubbo. We're having a drought that is longer than it's not a normal drought, it's not a 1 in 100 year drought, it's a drought that's been going on for a very long time. And that will inevitably drive the price of food up. So why should we care? Because sooner or later it's going to affect us. We're interconnected. We inter-are. We're 75% water. You know? And we have an effect on others. Our happiness is not just a personal matter. Happiness is a communal matter. Whether you're a right wing or a left wing, a dying planet is going to affect both of us. You know? As we face the end of rain-fed farming, we need to invest in greenhouse and hydroponic farming. And as food security becomes less for people, especially in developing nations, and even us eventually, we need to invest in communal food security. Otherwise, like Syria, do you know that Syria started because of a drought? And all the farmers migrating to the city, all the youth without jobs, creating a breeding ground for Islamic extremism, you know, and a breeding ground for a bunch of young men with nothing to do and no hope is a perfect recipe for for a war. That's how it started. And that's, you know, that kind of, before Syria was one of the most prosperous countries in the Middle East. Very civilized, very high standard of living. It wasn't Afghanistan, you know, it wasn't a very backward place. It was a very civilized place. That kind of thing can happen anywhere where there is a great extremes of poverty and wealth. You know, Chinese Revolution, Cultural Revolution, French Revolution, extremes of poverty and wealth. So we need to have soup kitchens, we need to have food security, and we need to hold on to our humanity instead of buying guns and building a bunker and looking at investing in moving to Mars. You know, rebelling is another idea. Have you heard of Extinction Rebellion? The people who are gluing themselves to the harbour bridge and creating arm link fences to stop traffic and make the government tell the truth and sign the Kyoto Protocol and make people aware of the problem of global warming and how it will affect them personally, because our government is still very much in denial. You know, I mean, really, like, scientists are saying that there could be social collapse in 20 to 30 years. So it's not just like crazy people who believe in aliens who are saying this. It's like scientists. It's, what is it, 96% of scientists saying this. The reports are all there to read for yourself. I mean, basically, capitalism isn't working. I'm not like I wouldn't say I'm a communist. I'm not, it didn't, you know, but the idea of infinite growth in a world with finite resources isn't working. We can't keep consuming at the rate we are. It's not sustainable. There can be no growth on a dead planet. Another way to deal with this is like only buying from food co-ops, organic food. It's not really affordable for many of us, but maybe when you get a job. Avoiding buying new things as much as possible and reusing, mending, recycling, upcycling, swapping, secondhand clothes, hemp, all of these things make a difference. Also, like using already existing infrastructures like high-rises instead of sprawling suburban designs of houses, because it takes up more land that should be used for farming. And inspiring loving kindness based on solidarity and unity. There's a wonderful Buddhist scholar called Bhikkhu Bodhi, and he's talked about the 4 noble truths of global warming. 1, there is the problem of global warming. 2, there is the cause, which is greed, which is denial, which is pollution, which is human activity, and the idea of commodifying nature, commodifying human labor, even commodifying human kindness. Everything can be profited from, the idea of capitalism. You know. And then there is the end of suffering, the end of global warming, which is the need to stop polluting, stop consuming, to stop mindlessly consuming. And then there is the Eightfold Path of climate crisis, which is right understanding that the truth needs to be addressed. I mean, okay, the Noble Eightfold Path, right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, right wisdom. But just to summarize, the Eightfold Path of global warming would be right view, meaning a human response for climate change, and understanding the benefits of a transformed economy, an economy that is based on it's like just sustained existence and understanding the value. This is sufficient. This is sufficient. I have enough to eat. I have enough to wear. It's enough. And cultivating more simple things like understanding the value of having more personal time, following the arts, purifying your mind, spiritual development, contentment, human relationships, going back to the horse and cart, slower pace of life. It's actually not a bad thing as long as we don't go back regressively with perhaps racism and rights of women and so forth. And, you know, enlightened self-interest. Okay, so you may have $1 billion for the next 20 years, and that may be very profitable. But I mean, even billionaires have children, you know. And when the society collapses, how much will money be worth anyway? Yeah. Right action, limiting corporate control of politics, limiting political sponsorship of politicians, limiting control of the media by corporations, giving other political parties, rather than two dominant parties, smaller political parties a chance, giving independent politicians a chance, reforming political systems and increasing the power of the United Nations and developing nations, giving developing nations a voice at the table. And adaptation to climate change, accepting it's real and preparing for what will happen. Rising waters, desertification, food insecurity, 1 billion climate refugees, limiting population growth, creating social welfare so that there is social stability. Because if people don't have their basic needs met, they're going to become violent. Respect for human life, solidarity, unity, equality, peace and happiness and shared prosperity on earth. But I think it comes down to, I talked about it coming down to love, because if you get involved in activism and you're looking at all the data and you're looking at people's inaction, it's very easy to become cynical, to become paralyzed by fear, to become depressed, to be afraid of being revolutionary, to be afraid of speaking up, to be afraid of being unpopular. But what is worse, the end of the world or being unpopular? Telling the truth people don't want to hear, or everybody dying? You know? Taking action now while we can. What will future generations say? You were the last generation that had a chance to do something about it and you did nothing. That is morally reprehensible. So it's hard because we're not politicians, we're not billionaires, you know. But I think if you look at people like Martin Luther King, non-violent civil action, creating civil unrest, like Gandhi, you know, the power of the people to change the course of history, to be annoying, to make them listen with compassion. Because, you know, to be driven by, because love cannot be love without the presence of justice. Yeah. But, you know, this kind of, you know, sometimes a sense of anger arises, and I'm a little untraditional in the sense that I think anger is okay. I think it's what you do with anger. There is a psychologist, I don't know how to say his name properly, but it's something like Gabe Mate. And he said that the suppression of anger actually is one of the worst things for your immune system. How do you say it properly? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
Oh.
No. Ask what was the suppression of anger? Is it like spiritual bypass?
You know, like you're trying to be a good Buddhist and you're feeling angry and you're just pretending you're not angry. You're suppressing it, basically. I mean, obviously, suppressing your urge to punch someone is probably a healthy thing, but expressing, like feeling your feelings and working through it, whether it's just sitting and breathing and acknowledging and later on understanding, wow, you know, where does this come from? Talking through it with someone, but not actually just pushing it down and pretending it's not there and smiling and continuing. And like, you know, if someone is transgressing your boundaries and abusing you, and you just again and again you say nothing and you smile, is that healthy in the long term? Because that person is just learning it's okay to abuse you, and you're just pretending, I'm not bothered by this, I don't have feelings, I don't have needs, I don't have boundaries, don't respect me, I'm a doormat. So it's a fine line, because you don't want to become someone who is abusive and is using their anger in unhealthy ways. But to feel a full range of human emotions for an unenlightened being is normal and healthy. The question is what you do with that anger. Whether you let that anger fester and it becomes something that completely dominates your life, which is very easy in activism when you get involved in social justice and you see what's going on everywhere. You see it everywhere. And perhaps someone who is... there is a difference between momentary anger as a normal response to abuse and carrying around triggered trauma, which always goes off again and again, and you're projecting from the past. You know, that's a different thing to being angry, to feeling angry in response to one instance of injustice. Carrying around trauma is a different thing. Yeah, but I was talking about love, you know. I was talking about putting love into building solidarity, to believing in human goodness, even when you don't always see it, believing the capacity for it to be there, for your motivation for trying to change the world to be love, not just depression, hatred, othering, you know, those damn corporations. Because no dialogue is possible when there is no love. Love as in goodwill. Love as in the belief that other people might have some sense of moral flame in them, some sense, as deeply buried by greed as it may be. And having boundaries can also be an act of love. Yeah. And, you know, having love, like having joy, having happiness. It's not just enough to, there's a great socially engaged Buddhist master called Thich Nhat Hanh, and he says to suffer is not enough. Just, you know, to be out there chained to a fence is not enough if you have no peace. So sometimes a greatest form of revolution, a greatest form of rebellion could be to be happy, to have self-care, you know, to go to your yoga class, to hang out with your friends, to make yourself a healthy meal, to rest, to regenerate yourself, to inspire yourself, to refill yourself, to meditate and find peace. You know, but in terms of spiritual practice, we think of Buddhism as like an otherworldly practice. You know, the world is, we think of it as going inside ourselves, leaving the world behind. But when we go inside ourselves, the pain of the world is still there. You know, when we go on retreat, we don't leave the pain of the world behind, it's inside us. Yeah? The world is us, the world is in our heart. The earth, without which we cannot live, is bleeding. It is part of us. The earth, others are our second self. The elements are our second self. With no clean water, no us. No farmer who grows our food, no us. No woman in China in the sweatshop making our clothes, no us. No suffragettes fighting for the vote, no human rights for women. the history of everything that has gone before, the rights that people fought for. The fact that we didn't grow up working in a factory is because unionists fought for children not to have to work in factories. Every basic right we have was fought for by someone who went before us. Minimum wage. You know, all of those things are part of us. The things that others have done affect us. So others are our second self. The earth is sacred. Human life is sacred. Human rights are sacred. We are interconnected. If one person in a family is very unhappy, it affects everyone in the family. So likewise with the earth is unhappy, it's going to affect us. So we need to do something about it. Our second self is suffering. We have to listen to her voice. We have to give a voice to the animals that, you know, the polar bear or the sixth extinction that is happening now, all those beautiful animals going extinct just for the sake of, you know, more pretty things, more shiny things to consume. I mean, if someone comes in and, like, if we're in a room together and someone just comes in and you're all just sitting there with your lunch, you know, and someone just comes in and grabs all your food and keeps it for themselves and smashes everything in the room, you wouldn't feel very good towards that person, right? But that's what we're unconsciously doing. We've lost touch with the chain of food production. We're not aware of how the animals we're eating are treated. We're not aware of how the clothes we wear, the technological items we have. We're not aware. Do you know there's children in Africa mining for some of the elements that go into our phone? You know, like we see it on the news. We think blood diamond. But we all want a pretty engagement ring, you know. We think it's someone else doing it somewhere else who is evil. But they're only doing it because we're buying it. If we didn't buy these things, corporations wouldn't make them. If we didn't want cheap things, they wouldn't pay those women nothing. So we're part of the chain of suffering. We need to take back the means of production and take responsibility for our part in what we consume and how we're treating the earth. Because on a personal level, we wouldn't appreciate someone coming in and taking all the resources in their hands. But that is exactly what is happening. Most of the resources of the middle class and the working class, the 1% billionaire class, has come in the last 30 years and taken a lot of those resources. And these powerful people are also steering the earth towards, you know, the Titanic iceberg dead ahead, in denial about climate change. So we absolutely have to take nonviolent action to save the earth and to save a future for human beings everywhere, and animals and plants and the planet. That's just my opinion anyway, and the opinion of many scientists, activists, social workers, sensible people. I mean, you pretty much have to be suicidal to not see what's happening and the consequences of it. And don't just be frozen. Don't allow yourself to freeze into hopelessness. You know, think about what can be done, and, you know, join an organization, become part of the process of change. And, you know, how long can we wait for these people who just endlessly debate? Like, it literally has to happen now. We have to be we're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution. You know, one person, the thing is, the idea of neoliberalism, the idea that the individually we can make a difference, individually we matter. No, it has to be a communal effort. We can't address climate change alone. Your bamboo toothbrush is not going to make a difference, you know. Just buying a more ethical kind of product, one person is not enough. It has to be group effort, communal effort. And we need to involve politicians, we need to involve the billionaire class, we need to make the corporations understand, like, I'm not going to invest in your product, I'm not going to give you my superannuation unless you invest in clean energy, unless you divest from fossil fuels. I'm not going to buy your newspaper unless you print the truth. I'm not going to give you my vote unless you represent my interests. And all throughout history, people have taken the means of control into their own hands, sometimes with very bloody consequences. But we have to do what we can. That's my take on it. Do you have any questions or feelings you want to discuss?
There are many things that I was thinking of as you were talking.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that came to mind is when you're talking about anger being useful in a way and sort of working action. It came to mind as a similar to Saul, who was kind of like
hate does not end hate, only love ends hate. That is the eternal law. Yeah.
Personally, I don't feel that I don't feel like I could be politically active in a way. Maybe I can overcome that at some point. Maybe it's something I should overcome. But the way that I definitely want to help is by the values that underlie these sort of things, like valuing having less, valuing love for all, valuing compassion, sort of changing sort of economic systems of saying consumption is not really that good at all, not really the goal.
And yet it's the economic system that's created this problem.
Yeah, exactly. It's not useful. I was saying that, it is a problem.
Yeah. So is to change it an act of love or an act of politics?
I want to do it from an act of love, but not politics.
And if politics is the mean by which we govern humanity, how can you do it without politics?
Perhaps. I don't think I know enough to know how politics works. Very politically uneducated.
Yeah. It depends what you mean by politics as well. You know, what some people call human rights and equality, other people call identity politics. But identity politics may just be a label that the privileged put on those with less privilege to minimize what they're saying. Think for yourself anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you can't choose not to be involved in politics because that is in itself a political choice. And you can't run away from it. Like everything is political, like every little choice. And I mean, I study politics, but I understand the fear of being revolutionary, like everything you said about, the more you look into the violations against human rights and the injustices, the more cynical and hopeless you get. Like, the world is based on like a neoliberal, like capitalist economic system based on consumption, based on like a narcissism, where you only care like about bettering yourself because the world's gonna end. So I'm gonna buy as many like shiny things now for myself, and yeah, like that's not right, and it's destructive to yourself and to the whole world. But it is scary as well to participate, to go against the powerful. I mean, like in Queensland, they're outlawing protesting, right? So, like, you could go to jail soon for protesting, and then sometimes I do readings describing exactly how, like, the prison complex works. And it's insane. Like, they are spending more money nowadays on prisons because it's worth it, because it's more profitable to make products like textile, and a lot of the food we buy for cheap as well is made in prisons. And okay, like, no one likes a criminal, but a lot of these criminals, like, only 20% are in there for violent reasons, and the rest are in there for like not being able to pay $100 fine for calling the police because they're experiencing domestic violence, and they're like an Indigenous woman in Australia, and then the police, instead of looking into that issue, say, but you owe money, you know, you have to go to prison. In there, like, people have complained about health issues,